They say a man's worth is in what he builds. Vernon built a good life, a respected name in his town. Then it all burned. The shop, his reputation, everything he'd known. He thought he was finished, just ashes and smoke. But some fires, they don't just destroy, they clear the ground. And that's where a new foundation begins. Vernon was 48, a mechanic. You'd find him most mornings in a greasy bay, elbow-deep in some engine. His hands, calloused and scored with old scars, spoke volumes, years of deliberate work, of knowing every bolt and spring. He wasn't a talker. His faded denim eyes, a little crinkled at the corners, held a deep, quiet strength, like an old oak that had weathered 100 storms but still stood firm. He looked like a man who'd been through the ringer, all right, but somehow he'd found his footing again. They say a man's worth is in what he builds. Vernon built a good life, a respected name in his town. Then it all burned. The shop, his reputation, everything he'd known. He thought he was finished, just ashes and smoke. But some fires, they don't just destroy, they clear the ground. And that's where a new foundation begins. Vernon was 48, a mechanic. You'd find him most mornings in a greasy bay, elbow-deep in some engine. His hands, calloused and scored with old scars, spoke volumes, years of deliberate work, of knowing every bolt and spring. He wasn't a talker. His faded denim eyes, a little crinkled at the corners, held a deep, quiet strength, like an old oak that had weathered 100 storms but still stood firm. He looked like a man who'd been through the ringer, all right, but somehow he'd found his footing again. His mornings began before the sun even thought about it. The digital clock on his battered nightstand, a relentless green glow, would cut through the pre-dawn quiet at 5 sharp. No snooze button. Vernon believed in an honest start, a direct confrontation with the day. He'd swing his feet to the cool linoleum floor, a small ritual, feeling the solid ground beneath him. A long stretch would loosen the knots in his back and shoulders, the kind that came from years spent contorted under chassis, a map of old aches and memories. Then the kitchen. Small but meticulously kept. Every dish dried and put away, every surface wiped clean. He'd fill the chipped ceramic mug, a survivor from a past set, with dark roast coffee, black, no sugar, no cream. He'd stand by the window, watching the streetlights fade into the growing gray, tracing the familiar lines of the quiet, older working-class neighborhood. The houses here might lean a bit, their paint peeling, but the lawns were always cut, the fences mended. No radio, no TV. Just the gentle hum of the old refrigerator and the steady tick of his own breath. It was a quiet he'd grown accustomed to, a silence that had once screamed but now felt like a well-worn coat, a part of his new skin. He worked at Pete's Auto Service, a modest garage a few miles across town. Not his name on the sign anymore, not his shop, not his legacy. Just a bay, a set of wrenches, and the endless parade of sputtering engines and worn-out brakes. The work was honest, if at times soul-numbingly repetitive. Transmission flushes, oil changes, brake pad replacements, timing belts, the mechanical heartbeat of the city passed through his capable hands. Day in, day out. He was good at it, relentlessly thorough. No shortcuts, no approximations. Each car was a puzzle to solve, a small act of restoration, a focused meditation that kept other, darker thoughts at bay. He treated every vehicle that rolled into his bay like it was a sacred trust, understanding its owner depended on it. The pay was enough, just barely. Enough for the rent on his small 2-bedroom, enough for the utilities that kept the old house warm, enough for his simple groceries. There wasn't much left over for anything else, not that he desired much beyond the basics. He packed a brown bag lunch every day, a bologna sandwich, an apple, a thermos of black coffee. At the end of the month, he'd sit at his kitchen table, spreading out the bills like a general planning a meager campaign. Electric, gas, water, a modest payment on his dependable older sedan. He'd pay them on time every time, a quiet defiance against the shadow of financial ruin that had once engulfed him. His word was still good, his credit painstakingly rebuilt, even if his pockets weren't as deep as they once were. It was a hard-won point of pride. Sometimes, after a particularly long day, the weariness would settle deep into his bones, a profound exhaustion that had little to do with physical labor. He'd drive home through the fading light, the city blurring past his passenger window, and a hollow ache would open up in his chest. It wasn't just the ache of age or repetitive motion. It was the weight of absence, the ghost of a different life, a different future. He'd pull into his driveway, the gravel crunching under the tires, and the dark, silent windows of his house would seem to stare back, reflecting only the man who lived within them. He was a man who worked hard, who paid his dues, who lived simply, meticulously. But sometimes, just sometimes, that hard-won simplicity felt an awful lot like emptiness. And that's when the shadows began to stir, threatening to break through the carefully constructed peace. Vernon would turn the key in the lock, the click echoing a little too loudly in the quiet house. Inside, everything was exactly as he'd left it that morning. The living room, with its sturdy, practical furniture, was neat to a fault. A faded throw blanket lay folded precisely on the arm of the recliner, not a speck of dust on the polished wood surfaces. He'd make himself a simple dinner, often something he could prepare quickly, a piece of baked chicken, steamed vegetables, or just a sandwich, eaten in silence at his kitchen table. No TV blared, no music played. Sometimes he'd read a newspaper or a worn paperback from the small collection on his shelf. Historical nonfiction, mostly, stories of other men who had faced impossible odds and endured. But even then, the words would sometimes blur, his gaze drifting to a point beyond the page, seeing something that wasn't there. His home was more than just a place to sleep. It was a fortress against the chaos he'd once known. Every object had its place, every routine its purpose. The meticulous order was a mirror to his internal struggle for control, a desperate attempt to impose structure on a life that had been utterly dismantled. He knew his neighbors saw him as the quiet man, the reliable mechanic down the street, always polite, always ready with a nod or a brief, respectful greeting. He'd help Mrs. Gable with her garbage cans, or Mr. Henderson with a stubborn garden hose, never seeking praise, just doing what needed doing. But he kept his distance. He learned the hard way that when you let people too close, you give them a chance to see the cracks, to feel the cold draft of the past that still seeped into every corner of his present. The days rolled into weeks, and weeks into months, each a careful replication of the last. The smell of oil and exhaust was a constant companion at work, punctuated by the rhythmic clang of tools and the whine of an engine. There was a quiet satisfaction in troubleshooting a complex problem, in coaxing life back into a stalled motor. He was good at it, always had been. The hands that once gripped the steering wheel of his own business, shaking hands with customers he called friends, now quietly, steadily worked for another man. He was just Vernon to most of his current clients, not Mr. Vernon of Vernon's Reliable Motors. He was a cog in a bigger machine, a reliable pair of hands, and that suited him just fine. It was safe. It didn't demand too much of him beyond his skill and his time. But it was in the dead of night, when the house was truly silent, that the carefully constructed piece would unravel. He'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, the streetlights casting long, angular shadows through his bedroom window. That's when they came, not like a sudden storm, but a slow, suffocating fog, the memories of another life. He saw Sarah, her infectious laugh filling the house, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when he told a bad joke. He saw Michael, small and bright, his son's arms wrapped around his waist, asking 1,000 questions about the cars in the garage, his voice echoing with the promise of a future that never arrived. A sharp physical pang would shoot through his chest, a ghost limb ache for a family that was gone, and then the other phantom would emerge. The roaring flames, the smell of burnt rubber and oil, the twisting metal that was once his pride and joy, Vernon's Reliable Motors. He could still hear the frantic whispers in the days after, the questions hanging in the air like smoke. How did it start? Was he struggling? Did he do it for the insurance? The insinuation had been a poison, seeping into the respect he'd painstakingly earned, turning it to ash before the actual fire department had even cleared the scene. He had been a man of his word, a pillar in the community. Now he was just a man who'd lost everything, with a question mark hanging over his name like a permanent storm cloud. He'd clench his jaw, fists tightening under the blankets, trying to push it all back, down into the dark corners where he kept it locked. But some nights it was too strong. The gap between Vernon, the proud, self-made owner of a thriving business, a husband and father, and Vernon, the quiet, solitary mechanic, was a chasm that swallowed sleep. He had wanted so much for Michael College, a life better than his own, maybe even taking over the shop one day. He had wanted to grow old with Sarah, watching their boy become a man. Those dreams, once vivid and tangible, were now buried so deep, beneath layers of grief and shame, that he sometimes wondered if he'd ever actually had them. He was haunted not just by what he'd lost, but by who he used to be, and the nagging, insidious voice that told him it was all his fault, somehow, for having been too proud, too content, too sure that his carefully built life was invincible. It was a heavy burden, carried silently, day in and day out, always just beneath the surface of his quiet composure. That voice, it had clawed at him, tearing at the foundations of everything he believed about himself. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for the real demolition. It started with a phone call late on a Tuesday night, the kind of call that stops your heart before you even answer. "Vernon, it's your shop. It's gone up." He dropped the phone, the clatter echoing in the sudden silence of his living room. He remembered the drive, the wail of sirens growing louder, the sickening orange glow painting the night sky before he even rounded the final corner. When he got there, it wasn't just his shop. It was a roaring inferno, a beast consuming a lifetime of sweat, grease, and honest labor. Flames licked the sky, spewing black smoke that carried the acrid smell of burning rubber and melting dreams. Firefighters, small against the backdrop of the inferno, fought a losing battle. He stood there, helpless, watching his empire turn to embers. His hands, usually so steady, trembled uncontrollably as he watched the roof cave in, a final, thunderous roar that extinguished the last flicker of hope. And then came the questions. The grim-faced fire marshal, the insurance adjuster with a too-sympathetic smile, the quiet whispers from neighbors he'd known for decades. How did it start, Vernon? Any recent financial troubles? Each question was a fresh wound, twisting the knife of loss deeper into his gut. He had nothing to hide, but the questions themselves were accusation enough. His good name, once as solid as the engine blocks he'd rebuilt, was now singed and brittle, crumbling under the weight of suspicion. Days blurred into a waking nightmare of official paperwork, endless phone calls, and the hollow ache where his purpose used to be. He walked through the charred remains, picking up fragments of tools, twisted metal, a half-melted trophy from a local car show Michael had won with a soapbox derby car he'd helped him build. Each piece was a shard of his former life, cutting him anew. He was financially ruined, the insurance company dragging its feet, the whispers growing louder. Then came the second call, Thursday, early afternoon. The sun was shining, a cruel mockery of the storm brewing inside him. Sarah had been taking Michael to soccer practice. A distracted driver, a blind spot, a sudden impact. The world tilted on its axis. He didn't even remember getting to the hospital, just the sterile smell, the hushed voices, and the doctor's grim face. "We did everything we could, Mr. Miller." The words were an echo, reverberating in an empty chamber. Sarah, Michael, gone in an instant. The fire had taken his livelihood and his identity. The accident had taken his heart, his future, every reason he had to wake up in the morning. The triple blow, delivered with precision and cruelty, shattered him. It wasn't just a loss, it was an annihilation. He was adrift in a vast, cold ocean with no land in sight, and the last of his life rafts had just been pulled under. The ensuing weeks were a blur of grief and numbness. The funeral, a procession of pitying faces and empty platitudes, felt unreal, a scene from someone else's tragedy. He moved through it like a ghost, his body present, his soul utterly absent. People brought food, offered condolences, their words bouncing off the concrete wall he'd built around his anguish. He'd sit alone in the meticulously clean house, the quiet a deafening roar. Every object, every photograph was a searing reminder of what he'd lost. He ate when he remembered, slept only when exhaustion claimed him, and spoke only when absolutely necessary. One night, the kind of night that felt like the world had forgot to turn, he found himself staring at the ceiling, the numbers on the digital clock glowing a cold, unforgiving 3:00 a.m. His eyes burned, but there were no tears left. He was empty, a shell. Who was Vernon Miller now? Not the proud business owner, because the business was ash. Not the devoted husband, because Sarah was gone. Not the loving father, because Michael was silence. He was a man with a tarnished name, living in a house full of ghosts, haunted by a past that had been ripped from him with savage force. The self-blame, a serpent coiled tightly in his gut, constricted him. If he hadn't been so engrossed with the shop, maybe he would have taken Michael to practice. If he'd only installed that fire suppression system he'd put off, maybe the shop would still be standing. If he hadn't been so proud, so sure of his footing, perhaps none of this would have happened. He dissected every choice, every conversation, every unspoken word, looking for the precise moment he had faltered, the crack that had allowed the flood to rush in and drown everything he held dear. He'd built his life brick by brick, solid and true, or so he thought. But the fire, the accident, the whispers, they had shown him how fragile it all was, how easily everything could be taken away. He was nothing. Less than nothing, a void where a man used to be. His life hadn't just changed, it had ceased to exist. And in that terrifying, desolate moment, he saw no way forward, only an endless, crushing darkness. And in that terrifying, desolate moment, he saw no way forward, only an endless, crushing darkness. It wasn't a sudden fall into this chasm, but a series of blows, each one shattering a piece of him until nothing was left but fragments scattered on the floor of his mind. He would relive them night after night until the edges blurred, yet the pain remained sharp. The first crack came on a Tuesday evening. He was under a Honda Civic, oil dripping onto his brow, when his phone, buzzing on the workbench, insisted on his attention. It was Mrs. Henderson from across the street from his shop. "Vernon, your shop. It's on fire." The words were choked with panic. He dropped his wrench, the metallic clang echoing in the suddenly silent bay. Adrenaline surged, a cold flood. He didn't even bother to wipe his hands, just jumped into his beat-up pickup and floored it. The plume of black smoke was visible a mile away, a grim beacon against the bruised sunset sky. As he rounded the corner, the sight hit him like a physical punch. Orange flames licked greedily at the roof, spitting embers into the night. Sirens wailed, lights flashed, painting the scene in a frantic, terrifying strobe. His shop, his life's work, Vernon's Reliable Motors, a place built with sweat, honesty, and every penny he'd ever saved, was being devoured. He stood numbly behind the yellow tape, the acrid smell of burning rubber and oil filling his lungs, tasting like defeat. The heat radiated outwards, but he felt only an icy dread spreading through his chest. He watched, helpless, as the roof buckled, then collapsed with a roar that seemed to tear at his very soul. All his tools, the specialized equipment, the lift he'd just paid off, gone. His reputation, solid as an engine block, seemed to crumble with it. He heard whispers hushed and quick from the gathered crowd. Arson, maybe? Who'd do such a thing to Vernon? But then the insidious ones. Insurance payout, perhaps. He was struggling, wasn't he? The unspoken accusation felt like another searing burn. Days later, with the insurance adjusters still dragging their feet and the ashes of his shop still smoldering in his mind, the phone rang again. A cold, clinical voice from the city hospital. "There'd been an accident. Sarah, Michael." His breath caught, lungs seizing. The drive to the hospital was a blur, every streetlight a flash of white-hot fear. The waiting room felt sterile, suffocating. He saw a chaplain, a kind-faced woman whose eyes held a pity he couldn't bear. Then a doctor, grim-faced, spoke in hushed tones, words like impact, fatal, instantly. Michael's soccer practice. Sarah was taking him, a truck running a red light, just like that. Gone, both of them. The world, already unstable from the fire, now tilted violently, spinning him into an abyss. He didn't cry. He couldn't. It was too big, too immense for tears. He felt a scream trapped in his throat, a silent, tearing agony that stole his voice, his sight, his ability to breathe. Back in the quiet, too-empty house, the true dark night descended. The silence was a physical weight pressing down on him. Sarah's knitting basket, Michael's worn baseball glove on the table, ordinary objects that now screamed their absence. He walked through rooms filled with ghosts, their laughter, their arguments, their easy presence now just echoes in his shattered memory. He'd sleep an hour or two, only to snap awake, heart hammering, the vivid images of flames and twisted metal replaying in an endless loop. He'd sit on the edge of the bed, head in his hands, feeling the cold tiles on his bare feet, the crushing weight of his monumental losses. Every dream was a nightmare, every waking moment a slow, excruciating torture. His pride, his livelihood, his identity, his beloved family, all ripped away in a matter of days. He was left with nothing but a hollow chest, a name whispered with suspicion, and a future that stretched out, desolate and vast, holding nothing but unending grief. He was beyond broken, he was disintegrated. How could a man survive when the very foundations of his existence had been pulverized to dust? He didn't know. He just existed, a husk waiting for the final, merciful collapse. He sat in the worn armchair Sarah used to favor, her knitting basket still beside it, needles poised mid-stitch as if she'd just stepped away for a moment, an eternity ago. Weeks had blurred into a shapeless void, a monotonous cycle of waking to agony and drifting into fitful, terrifying sleep. Days were indistinguishable from nights, marked only by the shifting light outside the window, a light he rarely acknowledged. He ate when his stomach cramped, usually stale bread or whatever he could find without effort, the food tasteless like ashes in his mouth. His clothes hung loose, his frame gaunt, his face a map of the desolation within, eyes hollowed pits that mirrored the emptiness inside. The meticulous order of the house, once a testament to their shared life, now felt like a mausoleum, every surface polished, every object in its place, just waiting. Waiting for what? For him to simply fade away, to join them in silent, still remembrance. He was a ghost haunting his own. He was a ghost haunting his own. The worn armchair, the still knitting basket, the untouched silence, they were all waiting for him to simply fade away. But one morning something shifted. It wasn't a roar, not a grand declaration. It was just a twitch, a slow, deliberate clenching of his jaw. No, He'd whispered to the empty room, the word raw and hoarse from disuse. Not yet. He didn't know what not yet meant, only that it wasn't never. He forced himself up, each muscle protesting, each bone feeling like it had rusted in place. He shaved, looking at a stranger in the mirror, a gaunt, shadowed figure. He put on clean clothes, the simple act of victory. He ate a real breakfast, toast, coffee, and the simple sustenance felt like a revolutionary act against the suffocating apathy. This feeling of not yet had to be rediscovered every single sunrise. The first week was a slow-motion brawl. Every morning the bed was a siren song, pulling him back into the comforting darkness. His mind conjured images of Sarah's smile, Michael's boisterous laughter, memories that were both a torment and a lifeline. Getting out the door, even for a walk around the block, felt like pushing through concrete. He'd walk past the empty lot where Vernon's reliable motors once stood, a charred scar on the neighborhood. Each time, the whispers seemed to rise from the very asphalt. Fire, suspicious, financial trouble. He'd lower his gaze, clench his fists, and just keep walking. He saw old customers, familiar faces, some offering a hesitant nod of sympathy, others quickly looking away. The shame was a live thing in his gut, twisting, burning, confirming every doubt about himself. He started knocking on doors, not for a new business, not yet, but for any honest work. He walked into every auto shop in a 5-mile radius, swallowed his pride, and asked if they needed a mechanic, even just for oil changes, tire rotations. "Vernon," one manager, a younger man who used to look up to him, said with an uncomfortable shift of weight. "Sorry, Vernon, we're not hiring right now." The subtext hung in the air. We heard things. Each rejection was a punch, each averted gaze a fresh wound. He'd walk home, the sun setting, and the weight of the day would press down on him, making the small house feel like a tomb again. He'd stare at the phone, at old business cards, at the stack of unpaid bills, and the sheer impossibility of it all would threaten to drag him back into the abyss. One evening, after the 10th polite but firm refusal, he found himself at the liquor store. Not a bottle for a celebration, but for obliteration. He bought a cheap pint, went home, and sat in that worn armchair. He drank it straight, the burn a welcome distraction from the deeper ache. He poured another, then another. The memories blurred, the pain dulled, and for a few precious hours he felt nothing but a heavy, dark void. He woke up on the couch, neck stiff, head pounding, the bitter taste of regret and cheap whiskey in his mouth. The light streaming through the window was harsh, unforgiving. This wasn't not yet. This was a slide back down, faster than he'd come up. This was surrender. He stared at the empty pint bottle on the floor, a symbol of his momentary defeat. A wave of self-disgust washed over him, a cold, sickening tide. Was this it? Was he going to become the man the whispers had made him out to be? A failure, a drunk. He thought of Michael, so full of life, so proud of his dad. He thought of Sarah, her unwavering faith in him, her gentle strength. They hadn't wanted this for him. They deserved better than a ghost wallowing in self-pity. A spark, small and fragile, ignited within him. It wasn't hope yet, not really. It was something harder, grittier. It was anger, anger at himself for giving in, anger at whatever forces had taken everything from him. And beneath that anger, a stubborn, unyielding refusal to let those forces claim his spirit too. He stood up, slowly, deliberately. His head throbbed, his stomach churned. He walked to the sink, splashed cold water on his face, then looked at his reflection. Still gaunt, still haunted, but a flicker of defiance now simmered in his eyes. He wouldn't be defined by the fire or the whispers or even by the monumental grief. He wouldn't be defined by this empty bottle. He would be defined by what he did next. He didn't know what that was, not exactly. But he knew it wouldn't be another pint, another night of forgetting. It would be something else, something clean, something earned. This battle wasn't just against the world, it was against himself, against the parts of him that wanted to give up, to simply cease. And in that moment he decided with a quiet, steely resolve that felt like a foundation finally settling that he wasn't going to let himself lose. Not anymore. He didn't have much left, but he still had that. That stubborn, bloody-minded refusal to stay down. That stubborn, bloody-minded refusal to stay down. It was the only thing left of the old Vernon before the fire, before the accident, before the silence. And it was enough to start with. He got up the next morning at 5 a.m. just like always, but the ritual felt different. No hangover haze, no dull ache of self-loathing. Just the steady thrum of his own pulse, the chill of the morning air. He made coffee, strong and black, and for the first time in months, he actually tasted it. It was still bitter, but he didn't care. He laced up his boots, picked up his lunch pail, and stepped out into the pre-dawn quiet. The sky was just beginning to bruise with purple and orange. He watched it for a full minute, something he hadn't done since Michael was small and they'd raced to see who could spot the first star. A faint, almost imperceptible lightness stirred in his chest. It wasn't happiness, not even close. It was just noticing. At the garage, the familiar smell of oil and grease, the clang of tools, usually grated on his nerves. Today it felt like home in a way his actual house hadn't in years. He wasn't faster, not at first. He wasn't chatty. But he was present. Every bolt he tightened, every filter he replaced, was done with a meticulous focus that bordered on devotion. He wasn't just turning wrenches, he was putting himself back together, one precise movement at a time. The work wasn't glamorous. It was honest. It was tangible. And for Vernon right then, that was everything. Days turned into weeks. He kept to his routine, a silent monk in a temple of engines. The 3 a.m. dark still came, and with it the ghosts. Sarah's laugh, Michael's eager questions, the roaring crackle of the fire consuming his shop. But now, when they came, he didn't reach for the bottle. He'd sit in the quiet, let the sorrow wash over him, then slowly, deliberately, he'd think about the day ahead. What car needed what? What part was coming in? Small things, anchor points. It wasn't a sudden transformation like a switch flipped, more like a slow, steady sunrise after a long, dark night. Folks started to notice, not much at first. Mr. Henderson, his boss, a man of few words himself, would sometimes just nod a little deeper when Vernon handed him a work order. "Good work, Vernon," he'd say, and there was a new warmth in his voice that hadn't been there before. One afternoon, a young kid, fresh out of tech school, was struggling with a tricky electrical fault on an old Ford pickup. Vernon watched him for a while, silent, then walked over. "Check the ground on the alternator," he said, his voice low. "Sometimes it's the simplest things." The kid found it, fixed it. "Thanks, Vernon," he mumbled, a little surprised. Vernon just grunted and went back to his own bay, but a small, almost invisible satisfaction settled in his gut. It felt good to help, not because he was asked, but because he saw a need and he knew a way. The meticulousness that had always been his hallmark deepened. He wasn't just fixing cars. He was restoring them, often going the extra mile without being asked or charging for it. He'd clean the battery terminals until they shined, check tire pressure even if it wasn't on the work order, just because it was the right thing to do. He found a quiet pride in the quality of his work, a pride that wasn't about reputation or status, but about the integrity of the thing itself. The car, the repair, the man doing it. Then came Mrs. Rodriguez, a tiny woman with kind eyes and a beat-up old Corolla that had seen better decades. Her brake pads were shot, and she was worried sick about the cost. Vernon could see the worry lines etched deep around her mouth. He worked after hours, replacing the pads, bleeding the lines, making sure everything was perfect. When she came to pick it up, he just charged her for the parts, telling Mr. Henderson he'd done it on a special discount. Mr. Henderson just looked at him, a flicker of understanding in his eyes, and nodded. Mrs. Rodriguez pressed a crumpled $10 bill into his hand. "God bless you, son," she said, her voice thick with gratitude. That $10 felt heavier, more earned than any payment he'd received for a long, long time. It felt like purpose. That small act, that quiet service, became a habit. He started looking for other Mrs. Rodriguez's, people who needed a hand, not a handout. He started fixing the leaky faucet at the neighborhood community center, tightening the loose swing set at the park on his lunch break. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't want praise. He just wanted to do something good, something that would last, something that wasn't about him or his past, but about the quiet ripple effect of honest effort. His house, while still spare and clean, began to feel less like a temporary holding cell. He found an old photo of Sarah and Michael on his workbench one day, tucked away in a drawer he hadn't opened in years. He didn't wince or push it away. He picked it up, ran his thumb over their smiling faces, and then instead of burying it again, he set it on his nightstand. Not to wallow, but to remember. They were part of him always, but they weren't the end of him. He still didn't talk much. The scars ran too deep for easy conversation. But his eyes, though still carrying the shadow of what he'd lost, held a new clarity, a steady light. The gauntness eased, replaced by a lean, grounded strength. He walked with his shoulders back, not out of arrogance, but out of a quiet, hard-won confidence. He was still Vernon, the mechanic, the man who had lost everything. But now he was also Vernon, the man who had found a way to build something new, something that lived not in brick and mortar, but in the quiet, meticulous work of his hands and the steady, beating rhythm of his heart. The fire had taken his old life, his old self, but it hadn't taken his ability to serve, to contribute, to simply be useful. And that he was learning was more than enough. He still didn't talk much. The scars ran too deep for easy conversation. But his eyes, though still carrying the shadow of what he'd lost, held a new clarity, a steady light. The gauntness eased, replaced by a lean, grounded strength. He walked with his shoulders back, not out of arrogance, but out of a quiet, hard-won confidence. He was still Vernon, the mechanic, the man who had lost everything. But now he was also Vernon, the man who had found a way to build something new, something that lived not in brick and mortar, but in the quiet, meticulous work of his hands and the steady, beating rhythm of his heart. The fire had taken his old life, his old self, but it hadn't taken his ability to serve, to contribute, to simply be useful. And that he was learning was more than enough. One sweltering afternoon, old Mrs. Henderson brought her ancient Buick into the shop. She'd been a customer of Vernon's for decades, back when he had his own place, and had stuck with him even after the fire, when he was just trying to keep his head above water at the new garage. She leaned on her cane, her face etched with worry. "Vernon," she said, her voice raspy, "I just don't know. Car's been sputtering something fierce, and my pension barely covers the groceries these days." Vernon listened, his head cocked slightly. He checked the diagnostics, then went to work. He didn't just fix the engine, he replaced a corroded battery cable he knew would fail soon, tightened a loose belt he'd spotted, and even topped off her windshield fluid. He worked methodically, his movements sure and economical. When he was done, he called her over. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, handing her the keys. "She's running smooth as new, no charge for the extra bits. Just glad to see you safely on the road." She looked at him, her watery eyes widening. "Vernon." "You didn't have to." He just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "It's good work, Mrs. Henderson. Glad to do it." As she drove away, the old Buick purring like a contented cat, Vernon wiped his hands on a rag. He watched the tail lights disappear down the street. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about recapturing some lost glory. It was about the sound of that engine running right. It was about Mrs. Henderson's relieved smile. It was about knowing he had done his best, done good. That satisfaction, quiet and deep, settled into his bones like warm sunshine. He realized that the fire had burned away not just his shop and his family, but also his pride, the kind that tethered his worth to his possessions, to his name above a storefront. He was no longer trying to prove anything to anyone. He was just trying to be something. A good man, a reliable hand, someone who helped. He started noticing small things. The way the light caught the dust motes dancing in the garage on a slow afternoon. The rhythmic clack of tools, a melody he'd once taken for granted, now a comforting hum. The easy camaraderie with his fellow mechanics, simple nods and shared jokes, without the constant pressure of ownership weighing him down. He even started carrying a small notebook in his back pocket, jotting down ideas for simple, low-cost maintenance tips for his customers, things that could save them trouble down the line. He'd never done that before. Before, he'd been too busy expanding, too focused on the bottom line. Now his focus was simply on the line of work, the line of service, the steady, honest thread connecting his hands to the needs of the community. Vernon had lost his empire, his identity, his entire world. He'd gone through hell and come out the other side with nothing but the clothes on his back and the calluses on his hands. But what he gained was something far more resilient than brick and mortar. He understood now that his old life, as good as it was just one story. And when that story ended, tragically and abruptly, it wasn't the end of him. It was just the signal that a new story needed to begin. A story not about what he had or what he was owed, but about what he could still give. He learned that you can lose everything, even your good name, and think it's the end. But it's just the end of that story. The real work starts when you figure out what you still got inside you and what you can still offer, even when you feel like you got nothing left. Life ain't about getting back what you lost. It's about building something new that even the fire can't touch. It's about the quiet strength of putting one foot in front of the other, fixing what's broken and finding purpose in the steady rhythm of honest work, day after day. And so the quiet man, Vernon, kept working. He kept building not grand structures, but small, steady moments of good. One repaired engine at a time. One park bench at a time. One quiet, resilient breath.